This is the first episode of the serie Futures, in which we interview key players in the design scene working in the public sector in Europe. We have planned this series together with Anni Leppänen as part of her larger research for understanding the current change in the government and the design sector. We wanted to envision collaboratively how this could be in 2030. This series has interviews describing cases in Denmark, Sweden, Estonia, and the UK. What are we going to do with the results? There are some events coming in Helsinki organized by the network of designers working in the public sector. We will show the results of these interviews in these events. The ones following the podcast know that I have been exploring different ways in which to use this podcast as a research tool. This is one way, making interviews, and with it creating a transparent research process. Many researchers do expert interviews. In this case, we record them and publish them as podcasts, so you can hear our wonderings and preliminary thoughts. And probably you can hear if we are guiding questions or missing an opportunity to ask something crucial. All our mistakes are here, open and in the wild. In Diseño y Diáspora, we had already done 17 series with different topics and in close collaboration with other researchers and practitioners. Only this year, we had a series on games, one on creativity and one on the history of design. This is the second series we do in English. The first one was about Finnish design in the public sector. It is only recently that I started to podcast in English, so little by little I understand how to do it. Let's go now to the interview we have today. Christian Bason was the first name that came to our mind when thinking in designing government. This is why his interview opens this series. Christian is the co-founder of Transition Collective. He used to be the CEO of the Danish Design Centre, a publicly funded institution based in Copenhagen, Denmark. He was also the Director of MindLab, the Danish government's innovation team, from 2007 to 2014. He wrote many books that many of us read on designing government. We will let him tell more. My name is Mariana Salgado. This is Diseño y Diáspora.
Yes, hi. So my name is Christian Bason. I currently am co-founder of an organization called Transition Collective. Before that, I was CEO of the Danish Design Centre for 9 years. And before that, I was Director of MindLab, the Danish government innovation team, for 8 years. And before that, I was a management consultant. Along the way, I've written a number of books and articles on public innovation and design and leadership. And I have a background as a political scientist, and then I have a doctorate in design and leadership and governance.
Wow, that was complete. Can you tell me what is Transition Collective?
Transition Collective is emerging organization. We are two co-founders, my former colleague Sune Knudsen and myself. And basically, just in very briefly, the idea is that society is facing some pretty significant challenges that call for transition, meaning shifting to, for example, a carbon neutral economy, or shifting to a more thriving, well-being economy, or addressing some of the most difficult challenges we have right now. And those transitions have to happen collectively. We have to do it together. We have to do it across organizations, across silos, across sectors, across disciplines, probably also across countries. And so the question becomes, how do we enable this collective transition? And I think we do that by bringing people together, right? So Transition Collective is really a collective of people that are trying to work with other people to enable these transitions.
But I guess design has a role there, right?
Design has a big role because design is in many ways about imagining the future. and we have to collectively imagine new and better futures to design them. And so for me, bringing the sensibilities and the approaches and the methodologies of designers into this mix is key. And part of it, I wrote about in a recent book called Expand, Stretching the Future by Design. It's also very much about asking what we think when we create, right? So not just bringing methods and process into the mix from the world of design and ethnography and so on, but also bringing the ability of designers to question and challenge assumptions, expand our view of problems and opportunities. And of course, ultimately, in my mind, design is very much about making abstract ideas concrete. So how do we, which some people would call implementation, but how do we enact, new futures in ways that are tangible and concrete and ultimately can be experienced by citizens or by people? So I think there's a lot of design, you could say, competency folded into the work I hope to be doing in the future.
So, could you give us an example of your work that relates to designing in the public sector? Maybe it's an example that it's already in the book that you just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the book I mentioned starts with a case study, which I think is interesting. It's a case study of sort of how far have we come today with design, but we're also using it as a jumping off point for saying how design must evolve in the future, right? But the case example is from the United States, where about 10 years ago, there was a massive crisis for a public agency, namely Veterans Affairs. Veterans Affairs is a public institution, a public agency in the United States, federal agency. It takes care of basically cradle to grave, literally, of American veterans and their families. It's a healthcare system, it's a social system, it's a career system. And at the time, 10 years ago, there was this crisis where a set of their hospitals had very, very, very long waiting lists. Actually, so long waiting lists that veterans died while waiting for help. And it became a national scandal. It hit the front page of the news. It actually led to the firing of the top director of the agency by President Obama, who was president at the time. And the big question was, how could this agency be transformed? And actually, not only the question of waiting times and backlogs of cases, but also of fundamental service design. So, for example, at that time, the agency had about 450 individual websites that citizens had to navigate to find services. And so what's beautiful about the case is that at the time, there was a government sort of innovation fellows program, and there was designer Sarah Brooks, who had become chief design officer of Veterans Affairs. So she and her team could go to work and to really try to transform the agency. And they started out with what designers do best. They started out with mapping current service processes. They mapped the sprawl of the current system, visualized it, because if you can't see the system, how can you redesign it? And using that mapping and the skills within her team, but also, of course, working with external designers, they actually build a whole new service design blueprint for the agency, reduce the number of websites from 450 to 1. We're able to radically reduce waiting times and basically create a joined up, coherent, meaningful service experience for citizens. So that's a powerful, I think, example of what can happen at a quite large organizational scale, perhaps given a good crisis, and then given the right skills and the right designers in place with top level backing. So that's kind of where we are at today with the sort of ultimate kind of case example in service design in government.
I have seen one presentation in which you were telling about the book, and you say something that it remains in my mind, that it is a fake contradiction that you can only think in short or long term.
Yeah.
Could you
explain
me that?
Well, I think it's often become a choice, and you can say that an example like the one I give here is very tactile. It's very much about sort of within months or a few years, transforming an organization to something that delivers better services. But at the same time, that kind of case example does not embrace 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years of thinking about the future of of war or the future of social services for citizens in that situation, or it doesn't rethink, the role of government in people's lives, whatever. I would say the contradictions is in many ways fake, because we can do both at the same time. We can address practices, behaviors, activities, services today, while still imagining what might a radically different system look like. And actually, I just ran a workshop this week with a Danish foundation where we explored what are the current practices within that organization that are pointing towards a radically different future strategy for the organization. And we also, of course, looked at sort of long-term risks and trends, and we were able to do both. The team was able to do both. I think what's powerful in design is this ability to actually stretch your thinking. And on the one side, imagine a situation that would be radically different, at the same time being curious and interested and engaged with what's going on right now. It is a fake contradiction, but because the disciplines of sort of immediate management and leadership and to some extent service design is more short-termist, and then the disciplines around foresight and futures and speculative design are much more radical and long-term, then they don't so often meet.
So yeah, that's a good one. But you also believe that AI is stretching the role of design, no? Or the role of design in the future?
Oh, there's a lot of talk about AI right now.
Yeah.
There was when we wrote the book, and then since the book came out, we had ChatGPT hit the world, and then things have taken off quite a lot. I think there's always it's not new that there's a conversation about the role of technology in our lives and in our workplaces, and there's a conversation about how that will impact everything. And in many ways, design has been an integral part of that. So just to give an example, to put it in perspective, more than 50 years ago, when something called microcomputers arrived in workplaces, and computing arrived, trade unions, labor unions in the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, were really concerned with the future role of workers. And so they started conversations in the trade and labor unions around how do we ensure that workers are part of designing the kinds of technology and the kinds of software that they'll be using. And that became something that is now known as participatory design, and which is now known as design thinking, which is all about engaging users in co-designing solutions. And so today, when you ask the question, what will AI and artificial intelligence mean for the future of work and for the role of workers of all kinds, including managers, then it's again a question of design. It's a question of how do we humans work with technology to design the types of solutions that are meaningful and relevant to us, and how do we remember to have humans in the equation? And by the way, not only humans, but actually probably also other living things and nature in the equation as we build technology. And what we are warning about in our book, Expand the Future by Design, is we're saying we will never want technology to lead us. We will always want to have a human questioning, ethically, democratically, in terms of our society. What we have to ask: what society do we want? What work life do we want? How do we want to live with each other? And then we use technology to meet our ends. And right now, you can be a little bit worried that we are just embracing technology for technology's sake, which is not new in human history, but that's kind of the worry, and that is an age-old conversation we still need to have.
I was thinking about this recent example at work. I've been working with the employment services at the city of Helsinki, and we're doing a futures process to 2030 around the future of employment, but from the digital point of view. But it is very difficult to detach digital from anything else.
Exactly.
So there is no such thing as the digital vision of future of employment. So I was wondering, how, related to what you were saying.
That's totally said like a true designer, because the further you go into the future, in some ways, the less relevant digital technology becomes, because we don't know exactly what technology will be able to do in the longer term future. That's very speculative. But what we can know is questioning how we want to live together, how we want to be in communities, how we want the connection between non-work and work to happen. We can ask questions about the value of work and all those things. So actually, my experience is that the longer term futures you look at, the less concrete you can be about technology. Now, of course, by 2030, we can assume that artificial intelligence will be even more powerful than today. We could create scenarios where there's, quantum computing has been realized already, and with quantum computing, that will, in an exponential way, shift the computing power we have for AI. So you can speculate about some scenarios, but I think already by 2030, it's very hard to say exactly what technologies will be dominating. So it's much more relevant to ask human questions than to ask digital questions.
Exactly, and harness the technology for human and kind of life purposes or the societies or social purposes.
Exactly.
So we have a few warm-up questions for you around future thinking, although you already kind of went to the future, so I don't know if you need this. But I think it's fantastic. It's fantastic. But we have been asking these two questions from everyone. So you can either take a personal point of view, or you can look at these questions from like the perspective of what is happening to the design sector or design in the public context. So the first one is, do you think the future, so maybe in 2030, is better or worse than now, and why?
Well, we're certainly living in a world where a lot of people are predicting it will be worse, right? And the World Economic Forum just came with its global risk report a month ago, and it's quite dystopic. Now, I'm a pragmatic optimist by nature, so I do believe it will be better. I'm thinking about my 3 children and how they will be more grown up at that time, and I'm definitely sure that our ability to work on problem solving will be better than it is today. I'm very optimistic around the moves that are happening also in global organizations right now around how do we address difficult challenges. There's a kind of an awakening going on in the middle of the crisis. And so I think bottom line is we will be in many ways better off, but we'll also be in 2030 looking back to the mid 2020s and say, wow, we really had a lot of crises on our hands back then.
This thing of being a pragmatic optimistic is something very common within designers, right?
I think so.
Well, because we always have to think that we could change something.
It's part of the profession. I mean, if you don't have that as a designer, I'm not so sure you can be a good designer because there's a sense of looking for opportunity and looking for value creation, right? Which is ultimately what design is. And that means that of course runs the risk of not seeing risks or challenges clearly. But this force, this power for making and shaping our world in better ways is really, really needed, because then you have other disciplines such as law or economics that could take a more critical and more, in some ways, negative perspective on both on human nature and on risks in innovation.
Yeah. So the second warm-up question is related to agency. So do you think you are able to influence the future, and how?
Me personally?
Yeah, or do you think you or we have an agency on the future?
I very much think we have an agency, and I think actually the only thing that has changed the future ultimately are people and people's ideas and thinking and imagination and determination to make that future become a reality. That's what's driven human history forward, both in good ways and in not so good ways. Now, I think the question of agency is very, very fundamental to a lot of the assumptions we have about creating a better future. I think I personally believe I have some agency in enabling people to see different and maybe better ways of working with change and the future. I also think that we are at a stage right now where there's what some people call a backsliding of democracy, meaning that when you look at a macro level, as a planetary level, humans have less agency now than 10 years ago. in terms of influencing and shaping their own societies. And so the question of enabling more human agency at all levels and all ways is a huge, almost existential question for humanity right now.
But in parallel to that, a lot of us, we are thinking in how to involve the more than human into design.
But that's become for me quite fundamental, and it's also a core point in our book Expand, because shifting from human-centered to life-centered design, or some would say planet-centered design, is really critical, which means at a very concrete level, consider nature in all forms, so climate, environment, biodiversity, as a core design consideration, as a core design criteria. And many designers were not trained to do that. And so they were not trained to think about the sustainability of materials or the carbon impact of choices they make, whether that is in the digital world or in the physical material world. So I think design as a discipline has a huge catching up to do. It has a potential to be a progressive force for bringing all forms of life into decision-making as we create new futures, as we create organizations, as we create things and create services. But it's a catching up game, because we are realizing very, very late the extreme impact of the choices we make in design, right?
Indeed.
This interview is part of the list D&D in English, Futures, Diseño y Futuro, Diseño y Políticas Públicas, Diseño y Gobierno, y Dinamarca y Diseño. The list can be found in YouTube, Spotify, and in our website in the recommended section. One of the things Christian said is that we need to think in short and long terms, in parallel, because both types of thinking feed into designing the transition for a better future. Or this is how I understood it. While the service design is more short-term, strategic design is more long-term. In my work, this has not always been thought of as a wholeness, and in many cases, we have done a project without thinking in the long-term vision, or the long-term vision was not aligned with the everyday demands of our doings. In the case of my work as design communicator, the work I do through this podcast, by hosting and publishing interviews, I also need to think in both the long and the short term. This platform, which features content in Spanish, Portuguese, and English, has evolved into a substantial oral archive of design narratives used in more than 30 universities as bibliography. Just last week, we celebrated the milestone of 500 episodes published. This is not only the hobby of a designer eager to connect with the global south, so I need to be more conscious of it and rethink the future in a more coherent and systematic way. This interview makes me realize this. Let's continue listening to Christian. He has much more to tell us.
So, really great answers to the warm-up questions, and now we get to the big questions. So,
these were the easy ones. Is that what you're saying? The small questions.
This was breaking the ice only.
But they are big questions. They are like really fundamental. So those were just to kind of orient towards like discussing what we're interested in, also understanding what could be the role of design in the future in the public setting, whether it's government or just public sector or common good in general. So the three of us, we know we've been working within this context for quite a while now, and design has been in the government for a good decade or even longer. And you've had a really interesting journey in designing in the public sector context. So what do you see? What are the biggest sort of changes you are seeing now? You have mentioned quite a few, or what you've experiencing. Like, how is design in government or in societal context changing, and how would you say it should be changing towards 2030? So
yeah, I mean, on the one side, we've had this quite massive move, right, where design and designers have moved into the public sector, into government. I think that's been fascinating to experience and be part of. And we also see that movement has been unevenly distributed. So you have some governments and some countries and in national contexts where it's been quite significant. And I mean, Finland could be an example at very different levels of government as well, from city to national government. A country like Canada embraced design and innovation labs massively, and then there was maybe some backlash. I'm not sure where the state is right now. In Denmark, I'm honestly seeing a less powerful positioning of design in government than there was when MindLab was there, even though there are now other bodies sort of advancing more broadly innovation in government. One of them actually had a 10-year anniversary yesterday. We had a reception. And so I think it's an uneven picture, but it's definitely a picture where there's much more embedded design and designers within the public sector than there was 10, 15 years ago. The big question in my mind is, what's next?
This is also our question to you.
Yeah. That's the big question. And actually, I wrote a piece on this. I wrote an article on this called Beyond Labs, on the future of civic design, which was kind of the theme for this journal. It's called Design Management Journal, DMI, the DMI journal. And my point about Beyond Labs is that the wave and the period of innovation teams and labs as the answer to embedding design-only ways of working and future-oriented ways of working, or innovative ways of working, or even just better problem solving, that age is probably in some ways maturing. So we're not seeing like a lot of novelty or movement within it. It's more sort of stabilized. It's also in some way hit the boundaries of how far can you go without asking the next question. And in my mind, the next question is the design of organizations, fundamentally. How do we manage, how do we lead, how do we run public and private organizations in ways that are unleashing much more human creativity, thriving, collaboration, imagination, problem solving, agency, distributed and decentralized self-governing and decision-making. And in my mind, it's where we have to go, because if you think that 5, 10, 15, or 100 people in an innovation lab can transform 10,000s of people in a public institution or a federal government or a national government or a city, cities often, have tens of thousands of people employed, then you're wrong. It's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen without those tens of thousands of people fundamentally working differently. And labs can play a role in the transition, in the shift, in the movement to transform. But fundamentally, everybody has to transform, and it cannot be a few people in the lab and then the rest. So that's, in my mind. I mean, I think labs have a key role in this move, and I'm sure that labs will have some form or shape also in the future, but probably a shape which is much more positioned between ecosystems or within ecosystems rather than internally as internal entities within single organizations. That's kind of that's the move I see, and that's what I'm working on with multiple organizations right now.
I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned many times imagination and creativity, but when we talk about the impact of design in the public service, we tend to think in how design brings coherence, consistency, how do we bring these tools, visual tools, and then participatory methods. But actually, not a lot of people are talking about imagination and creativity as part of what we bring.
Maybe not, and of course that can also probably vary from context to context, but perhaps it's because designers are beginning to speak like the managers, the lawyers, the political scientists, the economists that they work with, and are taking some of the radicality or the future-orientedness out of design and saying, oh, this is just a management approach to improving services. This is a way to higher efficiency. I mean, yesterday at this reception I mentioned, there was someone from Norway posing a good point, because there's a discussion that we had some kind of discussion, and somebody says, "Well, it's all about return on investment." And then this Norwegian leader, she said, "Well, what kind of return? Because who says it's economic? And in what time horizon? Is it short term or long term? We have to ask questions, be more curious about what kind of value are we creating." And so there has been, I think, some of the success of bringing design into government can be to take some of the wildness out of design. And of course, the risk that then everything that's done is very incremental. And I mean, nothing is better than before because, joined up services, coherent communications, shared language, all of those things are great. But we have to remember that even in a small service design workshop on some particular service, it is about bringing different people's perspectives into play. It is about integrating and synthesizing different competencies into joined up answers. And that is also a creative process, even though we might not call it that. And I can't help but think that maybe we don't use the word creativity or imagination because it's too scary for those organizations we work with to hear. And that points to the fundamental question of fear and lack of psychological safety and control, and sometimes, just fundamental management dysfunction that characterize many public organizations and many private ones. And if we don't address that, then we're never going to enable the transitions that we're going to need.
Yeah, this really resonates, I think, I'm sure with Mariana, you as well, because if we look at the three of us, like we have all worked in an innovation lab. Mariana worked in Inland, which was one of the first labs in Finland. I worked for D9, which was a state government lab a few years ago. And then we transitioned, or I think me and Mariana, we have been kind of also working in this sort of integrating design into government organizations and struggling many years in bringing this integrated approach. So this really resonates what you're saying. And I was wondering, like, sometimes when I meet new designers in government, I kind of see how passionate and creative they are. And I sometimes feel that I'm kind of very sort of, like you were mentioning about perhaps we are becoming part of the status quo, or at least I was thinking when listening to you, is there a risk that when designers spend so long time within government that we might become part of the kind of system upholding the status quo. So we need to be shaking ourselves to wake up and be wild and courageous again.
I think that's actually a point. I think it is a point, and it's natural, of course, because you are the minority, or we with the design sensibility and approach and thinking and so on are a minority. And that is also why it's often feels like a struggle for many designers. They also why they need protection by senior management or key sponsors to be able to do their work, which in a way is kind of crazy because you're saying, okay, here we have a group of people who are very clear on working on the future of the value creation of the organization, and then need to be protected so the organization doesn't kill them fundamentally in terms of, not literally, but kill their practices and push them out. And so that's why what we did at the Danish Design Centre the last 3 years of my tenure was to say, what if we radically transform the organization so that we shift the power, we enable people to make decisions much more decentralized, we allow everyone to be a leader, we allow everybody to choose their own leader, we shift power from hierarchy to process and advisory consultation. We make decisions by speaking with each other and talking together rather than somebody deciding over somebody else. And that became a radical experiment in redesigning an organization, which, it was a lot we did in one point. I think in a more incremental approach can also definitely work, or more sort of a smaller scale approach can work. But I'm convinced that the fundamental blueprint of organizations we have today in most public sector organizations is entirely unfit for the challenges those organizations are needing to face.
Yeah, I've actually been admiring the work of DDC in the past year. I follow them on social media and all the channels possible, and some of the events that they organize for international audiences as well. And I feel that they have really taken this strategic approach to design and systems thinking and futures, as you mentioned. And so I was wondering, related to this kind of approach that DDC has taken, is there an advantage of not being like specifically inside the government still, or could this be kind of something that could still happen also inside government structures? Because I haven't seen a lot of the sort of things that DDC is doing. Like, I would want to see that happening in Finland as well. But I'm kind of thinking, like, can it happen inside the government, or is there an advantage for DDC to be a little bit like outside of the government?
Yeah. I mean, DDC definitely had the advantage of being more independent. I mean, still receiving, at least so far, government funding. And so the Danish Design Centre, which is the sort of the government-funded body to advance the value of design for business and society, has been around for more than 45 years now, and is the organization that I led for 9 years. And for the last, now 4 years ago, we started a journey to really radically redesign the organization, as I mentioned before. And because the Danish Design Centre has an independence from the state, but still has a strong tie because of the funding and the contracts and the agreements on projects and so on. Also, appointments to the board some of the appointments are coming from the state. The DDC, for example, needs to follow government rules on recruitment, on procurement, on salaries, and so on. So there's a lot of public sector rules and conditions that are still there. But of course, being more independent allows you to experiment more, and it allows you to push the boundaries of what can a public purpose organization do. So we, of course, use that opportunity to try to show different ways you can, redesign organizations and rethink management, rethink leadership, rethink roles in organizations, and we try to do that very, very openly and share pretty much everything we did, which you can read online. Also, something came also in public media. Now, can that be done within government structures? I think to a large extent, yes. To the extent that the boundary conditions were not something we challenged. To the extent that after I stepped down about 4 months ago, some of my colleagues continued to work with other public organizations, including hospitals, on how they might redesign their organizations, and they've actually made some pretty significant changes in some of those clinics and settings already, which arguably are in sort of more service design and more service processes, of course, not in policy. But I've been giving a number of talks and presentations on this topic for public managers globally the last many months, and also, before I stopped the last few years, and I feel a lot of this incredible resonance and this incredible hunger after building and being part of organizations that are just fundamentally both better for people and better for society, and for that matter, the rest of the planet. And people are questioning now, I think, also maybe post-COVID, where we did see how we could change a lot of things quickly. Now people are questioning, why are we actually organized this way? Why do we need to manage this way? People are questioning where we work from. They're questioning the technologies we use for work. They're questioning how do we feel, where do we belong at work? I think we are underestimating what a shock to our system the COVID period was, and how there's a longing after being together in different ways than we are today.
And that actually brings one of this thing that the community has been, the Finnish designers in government community has been discussing, is age-old question that you already mentioned during the discussion, is the impact of design, and we are constantly kind of asked to explain it to our managers and high up leaders in the government, to kind of explain what is the role of design and what is our contribution to public impact. So we are constantly having these discussions with managers, government managers, and you mentioned that you have been talking to them. So I was wondering if you have any tips for us or the listeners about how should we maybe reapproach to these discussions with the managers in the future? Like, how should we talk to them about impact of design, or what have you learned perhaps in convincing them?
Recently, I was in another setting. I was giving a talk on my book for design community we have here, and on my book I co-wrote with Jens Martin Skibsted. But together we had this conversation, and then somebody in the room who's a non-designer, she's from a business school. She said, "Why do designers always have to talk so much about design, and why do you have to talk so much about the value of design and proving and demonstrating the value?" I mean, I come from a business school, and we don't do that. I mean, we just kind of do the work. And it's actually a little bit interesting. I mean, if you're in a public organization, nobody's asking questions about the value of people with a legal background. Or have you ever heard about an engineer that has to demonstrate the value of engineering to an organization?
Never.
No, actually never. And so you kind of wonder, what is this particular thing with design and designers that are so concerned with and so, in a way, insecure that they have to keep asking questions about the value of what they do? And are we being recognized? Are we being seen? Do they know this is actually design? And so part of me wants to say, just stop asking the question, just do the work, just be a colleague like everyone else within an organization. You just happen to have a design background, others have a political science background. Do the work, bring your profession into play, use your terminologies the way you use it, like everybody else uses their own terminology as well. We don't have to make everybody into designers. What we have to do is we have to solve problems together and create a better future together. And we have a unique contribution from our background, but there are also other unique contributions we need as well. So part of it, I think, is just let go of that notion that it always has to be recognized as design, that is so important. And the other way around, of course, I think there's a challenge to managers, as long as we unfortunately do have the hierarchy and the managers, to stop being so concerned with what is the value creation and what are these folks doing and so on, just because they look different or sound different or have a different CV. The other day, I heard someone working on in a leading role actually for innovation design in a big organization, and her senior managers had asked her to come with her CV to show them who she was and what she was doing, and not just hers, but the whole team in the design team. And they have been there for several years already. And you're like, why would they need? I mean, you wouldn't ask an engineer or like a lawyer to come with their CV after a few years to just remind the management who they are, what they are doing. It's totally crazy. And she actually said no, she wouldn't do it, which I think is courageous and totally right. But what I'm trying to say is, I wonder what would happen if we just stopped being so concerned with being recognized that this is design and we are designers.
But one thing is that there is not a lot of jobs or job descriptions in the public sector that would allow designers to apply.
That is true.
So
that is true. And
that's the other side of the coin. No, we want.
That's the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
But you know, I come from political science, and political science is probably the most prevalent background in total in the Danish central government. I mean, that's like 50% of everyone. So what I realize is that the key managers and decision makers that I've worked with over my career, they know exactly where I'm coming from. They don't have to ask any questions to know it, because it's like them. And they are looking for more people like them when they recruit as well, because that's comfortable, it's what they know. It's what they think they need. And so I think here we have the fundamental question that unless we get more designers or people with a very fundamental design understanding and background or insight into decision-making, into leadership positions, into the hierarchy, in the positions that do hire other people, then it's going to be very difficult for more positions with a particular ask for design and design skills to come in. And so we can do a lot of, you could call it lobbying or communications or case studies or proving the value and so on, which I've definitely also done a lot of in my time, and I'm still doing it in some ways. But what if some designers simply say, okay, I am going to step into a management role. I'm going to recognize that much of my time now will not be spent in creative workshops. My time will be spent in meetings, in boards, in making decisions. But because I have my background, when I recruit, when I decide on profiles of skills in the future, when I look at the future of our organizations, I will then bring in my particular perspective. But that is not the case. Designers don't like power. They don't like to go into those positions. They don't like the boring side of the work, which I understand completely. But I think it's a paradox, right? Because if we don't get designers into positions of power, they cannot use that power to make space in a balanced way for more designers.
I have two practical examples from what we are seeing in Finland in this sector, what the government designers are experiencing. We are more than 500 people in the community, the designers in government community in Finland. So it is quite a lot of people already inside government who are design-minded, and many of them are trained designers. But one recent news, maybe it was this week, the government announced that they are laying off 200 people from the National Institute for Health and Welfare, which is one of our crucial government bodies. So this is just an example that a lot of our community members are seeing, at least now in Finland, that the current government is imposing a lot of there's economic restraints, and there's a lot of even layoffs happening within government. So many of them are also concerned that maybe, and I've seen this as my role in kind of a design leader in City of Helsinki, that the funding for design has gone down in the past year. So, and I see these colleagues around government that are worried about the layoffs, and so I was wondering, even though we can, do you have any words of words for them who are scared of what is happening, and what could they do?
Yeah, I understand, and that's, I mean, it makes a difference, and I've seen that in other countries too. When a particular government flavor comes in, and we have it in Denmark too. I mean, we have a government right now that is in some ways very conserving, and which honestly does not have a vision for the future. And so, for example, there's just been a review in Denmark, external review, suggesting to cut funding from almost all innovation and business support programs, including Danish Design Centre, but also dozens of other institutions. So there's a proposal for making cuts. And so my former colleagues that are going very much forward right now to argue for why that institution and others are important and significant and needs funding. And so I think, of course, we have to be able to prove and demonstrate value in different ways. Of course, the moment the cuts come, then it's a bit too late. So I think part of it is, again, back to be part of the power system, to be positioned within decision-making rather than outside of it, to embrace the power structures that may be. I think another part of it is that at a time of crisis where, I mean, I'm totally aware that Finland is also geographically placed in a space which is a little bit precarious these days in terms of conflict. Now is the time we need to work together to solve problems. Now is the time we need the creativity, we need the problem solving, we need an innovation to work on these difficult challenges. This is not the time to push those that are the creatives, that are the integrators, that are those that can drive and collective problem solving out of government. It's the opposite. It's now you want to embrace it, and you even want to embrace it in a country like Finland that has such a strong, powerful design history and design culture and DNA. I dare say it. That's when you have to leverage your strengths, and design is a core strength, a capability of Finnish society. It was also a big part of the growth of Finnish society after the Second World War. So now when we're trying to prevent the next one, this is the time to really embrace it, not the opposite.
Perfect. So for the last question, what inspires you? What are you reading, listening, or watching in relation to design in the public sector?
Okay, I'm going to go somewhere very strange, to a book written by an archaeologist and an anthropologist, David Wingrove and David Graeber. The book is called The Dawn of Everything, and it's about the start of humanity and the first couple of 10,000 years of human history. And the reason that book, The Dawn of Everything, is so inspiring, I just read it not so long ago, is that it asks the question, how did we end up the way we are now, in a very unequal, very sort of a society where we are all kind of doing the same, where we all organize the same, where we all live the same way? How did we end up here? And is it a result of just one long progress of human history until this point? And what they show through archaeology and ethnography going back in tens of thousands of years to explore human societies is that we actually have been incredibly creative, politically, organizationally, socially creative. And we have not just moved from, hunter-gatherers to farmers to cities and then to modern society. it's been much, much, much more interesting than that. And we also have, and they do some very, very beautiful examples of indigenous people who created very sophisticated societies and systems, social systems that were way beyond and far beyond and more sophisticated than us in the so-called West, which we're now rediscovering how incredibly good they've been. For example, I mean, just as an example, people have lived for 65,000 years in Australia, and they've done quite well for themselves until the Westerners arrived. And now we're rediscovering how they were able to live in such a hostile and difficult environment in terms of climate and geography and thrive. And what are the leadership models around doing that, right? So I am inspired by the fact that we humans are incredible when we work together, and we are much more imaginative and much more creative than we think we are. And that is what we're going to need for the future.
Thank you a lot for the interview.
You're welcome.
In this series, we have some common questions to everybody and also some specific ones for each of the persons we interviewed. For example, to Christian, we wanted to ask how to talk in favor of design to modern government leaders, as this is something he managed to do and we wanted to learn from him. He answered that we do not need to make a point and highlight the role or value of design, but just do our work. Though making the point of the value of design seems busting our egos, and as it comes in the interview, it looks silly as the other professions are not doing it, still we see the need. Still we are doing it. Even though in Finland we have a network of 500 designers in the government, there are only a few calls for open positions in the public sector that allowed for designers to apply. And when these positions are open, they might relate to the implementation of digital service and not to strategic positions. Only a few are strategic. Anni is coordinating this network with others, and I used to be part of this team till last year. I have interviewed Anni in the episode 441. If you want to listen to this episode, you can know more about the network and her own work. I'm looking for the moment in which we stop making the point of design in the government and just do our work, as Christian suggests. As always, the music of the podcast is by Antonio Zimmerman. Sound design is by Andy Fecci. This podcast is published with Creative Commons license with attributions. This was Diseño y Diáspora. You can follow us on our social media channels in YouTube, Instagram, or X, Twitter, or visit our website. Remember to recommend us and recommend our books. Stay tuned for more. We've got a lot in store. Till next time, goodbye and design some more.